you know that my job is as a medical doctor, and what I do and what I've done for the last, a long time, maybe 38 years, trying to convince people that they ought to stop food poisoning, eat well, not take medications. And for maybe 26 of those years, I've had live-in programs, currently at the Flamingo Resort in Santa Rosa, California. So what I do is I take and I lock people up and I make them eat good food. Food costs money. Some people don't listen to what I have to say. Some don't do as well as I would like. So what I do then, I'm going to tell you my secret. What I do then, after they fail the McDougall program, is I send them down the street 4 city blocks to a place called TrueNorth, where the food expenses are quite a bit less than ours, because at TrueNorth, you get water. TrueNorth is a very world famous fasting center where they take care of people from all over the world. Yeah, they do, I'm exaggerating a little bit, they do feed them food, but also part of the program is a water fasting. So when I tell people who I either can't help get better, I say there's one more choice. Or, believe it or not, there's some people who won't listen to me. And I say, you think what I recommend is tough? Go 4 blocks down and see TrueNorth. And I seriously mean it. I send people on occasion 4 city blocks down the street to a phenomenal place called TrueNorth, where they get physician care. They do get food similar to ours, but one of the primary tools is a treatment that's been used. Well, I'll let our speaker tell you how long it's been used, what the history is, what it's all about, but this is another approach. You think everything's failed? You think there's nothing else to do? Well, let's have Dr. Alan Goldhamer tell us what else we can do. Welcome, Alan. And by the way, he's been my friend for over 30 years, and I do mean my friend. Thank you, Alan.
This morning, my goal is to share with you the experiences that I've had using a very ancient practice, which is fasting. In the past 30 years that I've been director at the TrueNorth Health Center, we have supervised this process of fasting and care with over 15,000 patients, and they've had a wide variety of problems. We have 48 people that make up the staff of TrueNorth Health, and they include doctors of medicine and osteopathy and chiropractic and naturopathy, as well as psychology. And we emphasize nutritional medicine, and we specialize in medically supervised water-only fasting. I'd like to start off here with a picture of a young girl. Her name is Kate. And she coincidentally happens to be my granddaughter. But Kate was one of 250 million babies born on this planet 5 years ago. But in what may be the most bizarre statistical anomaly of all time, my granddaughter Kate turned out to be the cutest one of all. What do you think the odds of that are? Now, my interest in nutritional medicine began when I was 9 years old, and I first met Dr. Doug Lyle. Back then, of course, he was just called Doug, because we were only in the 4th grade and he hadn't finished his doctorate yet. We actually met in a program for mentally gifted minors, where they took 30 students that had the highest test scores in the school district and put them all in the same classroom together. And it was quite obvious to me from the very start that Doug was much smarter and knew much more than the other children. And it didn't take long to realize that he knew much more and was much smarter than the teachers as well. But he had one very annoying habit. He always beat me in basketball. And it pissed me off. I practiced so that I could beat him. But it didn't work, because he also practiced. I read many books because I was looking for an edge. I read a book by this guy, Herbert Shelton, and what he said made sense to me. And so I adopted a vegan diet thinking that would give me the leverage I needed. But it failed. He also adopted a vegan diet. And to this day, 47 years later, he continues to kick my butt. Most recently, after weeks of practice, I challenged him to a free throw shooting contest. And I hit 48 out of 50 free throws, and I thought, that ought to do it. Dr. Lyle made 19, missed one, and then he hit 80 in a row. That's right, 99 out of 100. Of course, rather than congratulate him, I pointed out that, sure, Doug, you hit 99 out of 100, but you missed one. That's called choking. As a teenager, I met a guy named Gerald Benish, who was a chiropractor. And he told me that he had the best job in the whole world. He said his patients actually did all the work, their bodies did all the healing, and all he had to do was take credit for the good results. And I decided right then and there, that was the job for me. When I turned 16 years old, my mother had prepared a special family dinner to celebrate my birthday. And because she was concerned about my vegan diet, she invited my Uncle Gene to join us, hoping he would talk some sense into me. My Uncle Gene was a medical doctor. He trained residents at the local VA, and he knew absolutely everything about absolutely anything. He reassured my mother that children go through diet fads, and that so long as I ate plenty of chicken and gefilte fish, I'd survive. I explained to my Uncle Gene that it's called being a vegan and involves avoiding animal foods of any kind. He said it's called being a Meshuggah and I should stop the nonsense immediately. You know, as it was my 16th birthday, I knew that my father would have to have that embarrassing talk with me that all fathers have to have with their teenage sons, where they discuss, well, you know, what you're going to do for a living. Now, I came from a very liberal family. They believed that you could go to school anywhere, that you could study anything, so long as you ended up with a degree in law or medicine. So to save my father the trouble of having the talk, I decided to announce to the family that I had made my career decision, that I had decided to become a chiropractor. I thought my Uncle Gene was going to have a stroke and die. The veins in his neck stuck out so far, and he's screaming, "Chiropractor! Chiropractor! No one in this family is allowed to go to a chiropractor, let alone be a chiropractor." He said, "Better you should be a communist spy." After he left, my father, who was a very serious man, he took me aside. He said, "Son, your Uncle Gene is a very prominent medical doctor, and he does not approve of your idea of becoming a chiropractor." He says, "In my opinion, anything that makes Uncle Gene that angry, that mad, well, it can't be bad." He said, "So I say good luck to you, son." I went to chiropractic college in Oregon, and the most important thing I got from college was my wife. I met my wife, Dr. Jennifer Morano, and she's continued to renew my marriage contract every year. And this July will be our 30th anniversary, and this year I'm going to ask for a 2-year extension. I think after 30 years, I deserve it. After chiropractic college, I enrolled in the Pacific College of Osteopathic Medicine in Sydney, Australia, and I completed an internship with Dr. Alec Burton, who operates the Arcadia Health Center that specializes in medically supervised water-only fasting. I was able to receive extensive training and experience fasting involved in fasting supervision, and I helped care for hundreds of patients that were undergoing fasting. And I saw something really unique when I was in Australia, and that was I saw patients actually getting well. Under traditional medical care, patients with high blood pressure, with diabetes, with autoimmune diseases, do not get well. They are told to take the drugs for the rest of their lives. So how does your doctor know that you need to take drugs for the rest of your life? Because they're guaranteeing you that if you do what you're told and you take your drugs, you'll never get well. You'll be sick the rest of your life. Soon after we began treating patients with diet and fasting, a book came out. And it used the scientific literature to support the diet that we'd been advocating. And it was called the McDougall Plan. It was written by Dr. John McDougall, and it was the start of a change in the way people thought about diet. I'm not sure exactly whatever became of Dr. McDougall. I imagine he must be getting pretty old by now. The McDougall Plan inspired us to try to scientifically support the work that we were doing with fasting. And we began to systematically collect data on the results we were achieving, and specifically with high blood pressure. Later, with the help of one of my patients, Dr. T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, we were able to publish a couple papers in the scientific literature. Now, all the while we were conducting this research, my Uncle Gene refused to even look at our results. He said that in 50 years he'd been in practice, no one ever got well with high blood pressure, that we probably didn't know how to take blood pressures if we thought people were actually getting well. He said that if our results ever appeared in a peer-reviewed index journal, then he would look at it. A few weeks before our paper was released, my Uncle Gene died of a massive cardiac arrest. My mother insists that my Uncle Gene died just so he wouldn't have to admit he was wrong. I think he may have died from eating too many blintzes, kugel, kreplach, and knishes, but maybe we'll never know. So we picked high blood pressure to look at for a number of reasons. Number one, it was a major contributing cause of death and disability. Number two, it was pretty easy to monitor. And it was something that we saw consistent results on. If you look at this table here, you notice the only thing that really exceeds high blood pressure as a contributing cause of death and disability is really smoking. And actually, high blood pressure is catching up because, to a large extent, the smokers are dying. As far as blood pressure, the top number of blood pressure, when you measure blood pressure measured, there's two numbers. There's the top number, the bottom number. The top number, or systolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of the blood in the vessels when the heart contracts. And the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of the blood in the vessels when the heart's in its relaxation mode. And it turns out each of these numbers is a sensitive indicator of all-cause mortality. That is, whether you're going to die prematurely or not. Interesting facts. As I mentioned, high blood pressure, one of the leading contributing causes of death and disability. We're talking about 287,000 people dying from congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure is when your heart muscle itself loses integrity. So people with congestive heart failure, often they can't even lie down because their lungs will fill with their own fluids. So they have to lie sitting up. And high blood pressure is the major contributing preventable cause of congestive heart failure. Almost 800,000 people have strokes each year. High blood pressure, major contributing cause. Most people, if they live long enough, will actually develop high blood pressure, with the majority of people over 65 having this condition. It's responsible for millions of visits to physicians, and it's the leading justification for prescription medication. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the literature critically, drug intervention is actually fairly disappointing, with the improved outcomes really only coming for people with the highest levels of hypertension because of its reducing effect it has on stroke. So the majority of people that are actually having heart attacks and strokes related to elevated blood pressure are actually happening in people that don't have blood pressure high enough to even justify the risk associated with medication. For example, if a person has a blood pressure of 138/88 and doesn't have any end organ target disease, you may not be able to justify the risk of medication, but they still have 5 times the risk of dying as a person that has a healthier level at 110/70. And for every point your systolic blood pressure was reduced through diet and lifestyle intervention, there's a 1% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality. That means death from any cause. And that reduction goes all the way down to most likely around 90/60. So even a person with 120/80, which might have normal or average blood pressure, still has significant increased all-cause mortality associated with that same individual that went on a McDougall plan diet and reduced their pressure down to 90/60. So the first paper we were involved with publishing was called Medically Supervised Water-Only Fasting in the Treatment of Hypertension. And we took 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure, and 174 people were able to lower their blood pressure enough to eliminate the need for medications. If we look at a chart that talks about what actually works in lowering blood pressure, we find there's a number of things that really do work. Weight loss. For every kilogram of weight you lose, there's a predictable average reduction in systolic blood pressure. A vegetarian high-fiber diet, independent of weight loss, will reduce blood pressure. And notice alcohol. Boy, nowadays you'd think alcohol was some kind of health food. If you don't drink now, you ought to start or whatever. And yet, alcohol is a significant contributing factor to elevated blood pressure. And you notice that exercise, people that exercise regularly have lower blood pressure. Drugs do reduce blood pressure, but not without significant cost. And it's not just the chronic cough and the fatigue and the impotence that's associated with these medications, but also death. You notice sodium restriction can be associated with a reduction in blood pressure. This was actually a study done by that same guy, Dr. John McDougall, at St. Helena Hospital, where he got a massive average reduction in a relatively short intervention. And this was the JMPT study that Dr. Campbell helped us publish, where an average drop was over 37 points. And if we look at people with the highest levels of hypertension, that is stage 3 hypertension, where you clearly could justify medication, these patients start with an average systolic blood pressure of 180 milligrams per cent. They drop their blood pressure 60 points, plus whatever effect their medication might have been having. That's the largest effect that have ever been published in the scientific literature in treating high blood pressure in humans. They start with more moderate levels of hypertension. They have proportional reductions. This is very effective at normalizing blood pressure, even in people that have had persistent difficulties. Our second paper was called Medically Supervised Fasting in the Treatment of Borderline Hypertension. It was the same basic approach where we took people, we fasted them anywhere from 5 to 40 days that had more moderate levels of hypertension. The results were proportional and predictable. Once we published these papers, we got quite a bit of attention, including one of California's more powerful labor unions, the International Union of Operating Engineers. They approached us about making this program a covered benefit for their members. And we knew that that wasn't going to happen, but they invited us to come and do a presentation, so Dr. Lyle and I went to their headquarters. This union these guys are the ones that build your highways and crane operators and all this type. And we had a meeting room, and they had a bunch of people there for us to present to, and we presented our data. And it was interesting. The first person that objected was actually a gentleman representing the contractors that hires the union operators. And they said that, they already spend too much on health care. They didn't think it was reasonable to have to send people on vacation. I explained to him actually what happens during fasting, and then he thought maybe it wasn't actually a vacation, but he didn't think it would work. There was a reviewer there from the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and he said he thought it would actually work if you could get people to do it, that it would probably result in substantial cost savings based on his review of our data. The funniest thing, though, was there was a guy there who was an actuary, and he used to calculate like the monthly pension benefits these guys get. If they live to retirement, they get a monthly benefit. And he said, Dr. Goldhamer, if we were to do this program, wouldn't it substantially increase their retirement costs by making them live longer? I know, I thought, oh my gosh, they really think this way. I didn't know what to say. This guy stood up before I could come up with something. And I immediately knew he was a crane operator because his neck was much bigger than my thigh. And he said, listen, little man, you should remember who you work for. You work for us. He says, why don't you calculate how much money we're going to save if I come back there and break your neck? And then they voted unanimously to make the program a fully covered medical benefit for any member of the union or their family that had high blood pressure or diabetes. And for the next 10 years, we had over 100 union people go through this program. And what they asked us to do was to do a study to see whether or not it actually worked. We did a study. We took the first 30 consecutive members that they sent to us, and on a 3-week average stay, and they dropped 26 pounds. At 1 year follow-up, they were down 28. And you can see their systolic blood pressure, which dropped substantially, and they were able to maintain those results. Not as well as they should have, but they did pretty well over follow-up. And of course, when they looked at their direct out-of-pocket costs from the union per member per year, they found they saved more money in 1 year than the entire cost of the program. So they extended the program, and we went on for over a decade working with this group. Because it turns out it was cheaper to get people well than cut off their feet and treat their heart attacks and strokes. Now, what was interesting is, remember, this is some years ago, there were some people that weren't too happy with a major labor union offering a contract making this program beneficial. And so the California Board of Medical Quality Assurance determined that recommending fasting constituted such a gross violation of the standard of medical practice that it rose to the level of criminal negligence. And so I had to actually retain a criminal defense attorney to represent me against potential charges from the Attorney General's office that represents the medical board. I was the first person in my family that needed the services of a criminal defense attorney. My mother was so proud. Fortunately, eventually, with the help of our friends at the union, everything went away. This is actually a picture of my grandson. My grandson, Colin, is now just about to turn 10 years old. And he is a constant reminder to me of how much things have changed since I've been in practice. I had to explain to Colin the other day what it meant to send somebody a letter. I said, you take a piece of paper and you write your message on it, and you fold it up and you put it in an envelope and you address the envelope and you put on a zip code, and then you buy a stamp which you affix to the envelope. And you give the envelope to somebody who takes it to the post office and they put it in a sorting machine. And then they give it to somebody else who gives it to somebody else, and hopefully a week later your party gets the message. And he said, oh, Grandpa, I know all about that. We studied that in school. It's called the Pony Express. He said, Grandpa, that's just silly. He said, you just give me the message. I scan and email it, and it's there in 45 nanoseconds. I said, well, Colin, I'm so proud of you that you know all about computers and scanning and email. And he said, why are you so impressed, Grandpa? And I said, because when I was a little boy, we didn't have computers. He said, "Oh, Grandpa, were you poor?" I said, "We weren't poor. They didn't have invented them." He said, well, Grandpa, when you were a little boy, had they invented electricity?" I said, "Yeah, my friend Thomas discovered." I said, "Of course we had electricity." He says, "Well, what were you people thinking? If you had electricity, you should have had computers." So right now, water or fasting has actually become topical. So if you read, there's recently articles and everywhere from Harper's and GQ and all your popular press, articles coming about fasting. Now there's different types of fasting. The fasting I'm talking about today is water-only fasting or total fasting. But there's also periodic fasting where people do relatively brief interventions. There's intermittent fasting where they do, which is actually probably better term, intermittent feeding, where they manipulate the feeding window so people eat over a shorter period of time, so there's a longer period of fasting between their final meal and the first meal. And there's calorie restriction. So there's a lot of different versions of this. I recently did an interview with a popular magazine, and the reporter said, well, why is it all of a sudden, everywhere we turn, we're reading about fasting? And I was trying to explain that it's because with fasting, something really novel happens they're not used to seeing in medicine, and that's where people get well. You actually get recovery. Today, we're talking about total fasting, okay? The complete abstinence of all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. Now, fasting and starvation are often used interchangeably, even in the scientific literature, but they really represent completely different processes. Fasting is when you have labile reserves. If you go fast long enough, you eventually deplete your labile reserves, and then you enter a process called starvation. Now, the problem with starvation is that once you enter starvation, not long after that, you die. So we don't do that because it would really be bad for our outcome data. The biochemistry of fasting is such that if you take, say, a 70-kilogram male, 154-pound male, a thin male, and they're going to run about 18% body fat, which means that at a calorie per kilogram per hour, that means that thin male could fast about 70 days. So people can go much longer than they think, even thinner people. However, moderate activity will double caloric utilization and increase protein utilization and other variables. So it's important when fasting is done, particularly total fasting, resting be a part of the process. There are essentially 4 phases of fasting. You all have gone through this gastrointestinal phase. That's where you utilize the materials that are actually in your digestive system after the meal. Eventually, you use up the sugars and fats that you've ingested, and so you go through a process called glyconeogelysis, where you mobilize glycogen reserves in order to get the sugar that your body and particularly your brain needs. Eventually, you can use up your glycogen reserves. If anybody's ever been on a marathon, unless you're a highly conditioned athlete, at around 18, 20 miles, you run into something they call the wall, which at least in part is probably associated with depletion of glycogen stores. That's why they do carb loading and other things before in training to try to increase glycogen stores so you can get through this process. But once you do use up your glycogen stores, you go into a process called gluconeogenesis, where your body will convert, not particularly efficiently, but nonetheless, it will convert proteins into sugars to maintain the brain's needs. And the 4th phase of fasting is ketosis, where the body actually begins to break down fat. And what's really cool in human beings is that we have a bi-fuel brain. Not many creatures on this planet have that, but humans do. And that means the brain actually changes from burning its normal fuel of glucose into burning ketone bodies, which are a byproduct of fat metabolism. The reason humans had to have this ability to fast, the reason that fasting is a biological adaptation for humans, is because we have this huge bulbous neuronal net at the end of our spinal column called the brain, whose main fuel is glucose. Were it not for our ability to change fuels, the first time spring came late, all the humans would have died. For example, We share a lot of genes with things like chimpanzees, but they can't do prolonged fasting because chimps' brains keep burning glucose, whereas humans change over. Biochemistry of fasting, essentially it's about how to draw fat, spare your proteins, and conserve your nutrient resources. That's basically what this process is about. Indications for fasting. It's interesting, the most obvious indication for fasting is the loss of appetite that characterizes acute disease. People with acute or chronic illnesses, there are situations where fasting can be the fastest way to resolve it. Fasting, contrary to what people's intuition is, actually speeds healing. It doesn't slow it. It's useful at changing behaviors. For example, smokers, by the second day of fasting, generally report no cravings of withdrawal. It's a very rapid way of getting through that process. Now, Dr. McDougall says the reason the smokers don't complain is they're so miserable from fasting that they don't notice that they're not smoking. But he could be right. And also psychospiritual. It's interesting that virtually every religion has a tradition about fasting. And there's a reason for that, because fasting changes the way people think and feel about themselves, about the world around them. Most important thing about fasting is to get the right patients. At the TrueNorth Health Center, we specialize in treating people that are going to have good results. And the way we make sure that we only take people that are going to have good results is we go through a proper history, a physical exam, we do appropriate laboratory testing. What's really important with fasting is to understand that sometimes in the process of getting well, there are various symptoms that happen, which we'll talk about. But to tell the difference between a good thing and a bad thing, you have to have baseline data. So it's important to understand the history, the exam. It's important to have laboratory testing so we can tell the difference as we go along if what's going on is a positive attempt by the body to heal itself versus a problem that needs to be dealt with. So what's the general experience of fasting? Well, the first almost universal experience is that your mouth tastes like something crawled in there and died. It's what we call faster's mouth. So initially it's very unpleasant. Also, increased body odor. Sometimes you don't even want to be in the same room with yourself. Fatigue. Sometimes people feel very weak and fatigued, as you might imagine. In part because they're withdrawing from some of the chemical substances they shouldn't have been using, in part because the body's going through an adaptive process to deal with fasting. Sleep disturbance. Sometimes people have very vivid dreams and don't need to sleep quite as much in fasting as the normal state. Restlessness and irritability. Take people's foods and drugs away from them. You think they might get a little irritable? Oh yeah. Put 50 or 60 of them all together. It's very entertaining. Fasting euphoria. People sometimes go through a little euphoria. Dizziness, aches and pains. And they're characteristic. Initially, as the kidney's doing a lot of dumping, you get some low back aches. You get problems if you've had arthritis and other problems. Sometimes those joints will activate. Nausea and vomiting. You get a lot of bile dumping, particularly people that have been on greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diets. They'll dump a lot of bile. They may get nausea, vomiting. The bile can irritate the rectum as they pass it. They can have rashes and discharges. Materials come through the skin. And the healing crisis, where they're pretty sure they're going to die as the body generates an acute response out of a chronic problem. Now, for those of us that have experience with fasting, we see these things often as positive things that we realize the body's making a healing attempt. But for people that don't understand fasting, this isn't always seeming like a positive thing. And this was brought home to me some years ago when a patient was referred to me by a local doctor here in Clear Lake. And this doctor sent in a woman he had. She was an older woman in her mid-70s. She had arthritis. She had hypertension. She was overweight. She was on a lot of medications. And she told me that her doctor had said that we could help her. And I said, perhaps. And she said, my doctor, I've known him for 20 years, and I love him, but he's such a kidder. He's always kidding me. He said you were going to put me in a room and not feed me for 2 weeks. She thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. And I told her it would be at least 3. And she said, what? You mean like nothing at all? Just water only? And I said, yeah, we call it fasting. And she said, well, what would happen to me if I had water only for 3 weeks? And I said, well, first your mouth's going to coat up and taste like something crawled in there and died. And then you're going to smell really bad. And you're going to feel fatigued, and you're going to have irritability and dizziness and aches and pains and maybe some nausea and vomiting and rashes and discharges, and you may have a healing crisis where you think you're going to die. And she said, well, my, you're quite the salesman, aren't you? Where do I sign up? Well, it's interesting, she fasts 26 days, okay? And I'm telling you the story, obviously, she had a good outcome, you know. It wouldn't be a very good story if it was like, oh, and she passed away, you know. She fasts 26 days. She goes back to Dr. Clear Lake that sent her in. And she walks in his office, and he picks up the phone and calls me with her sitting there. And he said, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He said, but she said you fasted her on water only for 26 days. How the heck did you do that? I said, well, you know, she was a little reluctant. So we tied her up. And he said, you did not. And then he turned to her and said, did they tie you up? And she said, well, not till after the second week. He quit his job and he joined our staff because he said he wanted to spend the last years of his life doing something worthwhile. Fasting duration ranges from a few days to a few weeks, depending on what's going on. We never know exactly how long the optimum fast should be until the person's fasting, because fasting is not just therapeutic, it's also diagnostic. A lot of times you can tell by what symptoms the person's going from where they are in resolving the problem. For example, with blood pressure, very simple. We want to fast until blood pressure is normal because we know from experience that wherever we end that fast, 6 months later on average, that's where the person's going to be. So if we can bring a person down low enough to eliminate the need for medication, there's an excellent chance that we'll be able to keep people free from medication. So not everybody can fast ideally as long as we want them to fast to get through their problem. Maybe they have physical limitations. Maybe they have time limitations. And so we have to kind of work with all those limitations, and sometimes it might be several fasts over time in order to achieve the ultimate long-term goals. And also it depends on the nature of the problem. Some problems we know take a longer time, others can be resolved quickly. Mechanisms of fasting. Now, I mean, one of the things that I've said here that should be a little disturbing is I've said, for example, that the leading cause of death and disability is best treated essentially doing nothing compared to doing everything. How is it possible that doing nothing, like fasting, could be more powerful at affecting things like high blood pressure, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases, things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and ulcerative colitis and ankylosing spondylitis and asthma, eczema, and psoriasis? How could so many different conditions respond to this very ancient practice? So let's take a look at potential mechanisms, things that might be involved with fasting. Number one, weight loss. What percentage of people do you think that go on a water-only fast will lose weight? 10%? 50%? 100%? Yeah. That sounds like some kind of quack thing, doesn't it? The 100% effective. But it turns out the laws of physics and thermodynamics tell us that if you don't eat, you will lose weight. I did have one patient one time who said, no, she wouldn't lose weight. I said, what do you mean you wouldn't lose weight? Of course, no, I've been on every diet, I always gain weight. She goes on the fast, very first day, what happens? She gains a pound. She held some fluid. And she felt so vindicated. She said, see, Dr. Goldhamer, water-only fasting, I still gain weight. She lost a pound a day just like everybody else overall. So overall, average weight loss in fasting, pound a day. Natriuresis, there's a selective elimination of sodium from the body in fasting. It happens very rapidly. It's much more powerful, for example, than diuretics, like hydrochlorothiazide or something. There's this massive diuresis that occurs in water-only fasting that allows fluid to come off. So you'll see a very rapid drop in weight because of the fluid. You'll see a drop in blood volume, which drops blood pressure. It also gets rid of a lot of the swelling, so a lot of the non-healing wounds and other things that are limited by circulation start to respond very quickly. Okay, the detoxification. There's this idea that people have toxins in their body. Is that true? Do people really have toxins inside their cells? Turns out they do. There's two kinds of things referred to as toxins. One are exogenous toxins. Those are the things that you all are aware of. Things like pesticide residues and heavy metals and mercury and dioxin and all these chemicals that really shouldn't even be in the environment. But they are, and so they get into us. Interestingly enough, the single best way of getting toxins into your body, the single best way in terms of things you do, it's diet, and particularly animal foods. Because meat, fish, phthalates, and dairy products biologically concentrate the substances from their environment into their tissues, and it builds up day after day, week after week, month after month. When you kill and eat an animal or eat its byproduct, you get its entire lifetime accumulation all in that mouthful. So if you look at it, you may have 10 to sometimes even 1,000 times the concentration of some of these chemicals in a calorie of animal food that you might get from a calorie of plant food. So one of the things that benefits from eating a plant-based diet is that you reduce your potential exposure to some of these exogenous toxins. There's also endogenous toxins. These aren't really technically toxins. These are normal intermediary products of metabolism. But sometimes when they're there too much, like too much cholesterol or too much uric acid, they can interfere with cellular function. And as a consequence, mobilizing and eliminating these substances may have potential benefit. In fact, that's one of the criticisms some people make about fasting, is that this process of detoxification may happen so rapidly that it would result in organ damage and bad outcomes. It's not at all been our experience. In fact, the body does a really good job of regulating, mobilizing, and eliminating these products quite efficiently during fasting. More recently, there's been some excellent work done by Walter Longo and Mattson, where they look at the effect of fasting as it has on particularly cancer, both in animals and in humans. And these basic stem cells, these hemopoietic stem cells, function as a major source of morbidity and mortality. And in fact, they were thought to be irreversible and associated with aging. Find out that's not quite true. These cells can reverse. The limitation of these types of cells also limits effectiveness of chemotherapy. In other words, if you use chemotherapy or radiation, these cells can be very sensitive, and so at some point you kill the host by overdosing the chemotherapy and radiation. So it's been a limiting factor up to now how much treatment can be provided in terms of trying to treat cancer. What they found was if they use fasting in conjunction with this, fasting protects healthy cells and it makes cancer cells more vulnerable to conventional treatment. So there was obviously a tremendous amount of interest that's taking place now because it's a way of them doing conventional treatment with less toxic effect and more effectiveness. And in fact, it's quite dramatic. So we're looking at dramatically more effect, both again in rats and now they're starting to do in human beings. It turns out that even without chemotherapy and radiation, the genomics associated with cancer begin to turn off with fasting. And so they're suggesting that prolonged fasting may represent a profound way of impacting both the aging process itself and enhancing treatment. This is just a diagram to give you an idea that you have these primary cells that eventually become other cells, but if you interfere with them anywhere along the pathway, of course, the critical cells that you need in order to protect your immune system don't form, and that's one of the potentials that fasting has, is to help deal with that issue. There's also there's what they call DSR and DSS. Differential stress resistance is enhanced during fasting because oncogenes, the things that control cancer, don't do a good job of regulating stress resistance. And DSS refers to differential stress sensitization. It means that cancer cells don't do well in extreme environments. Part of that's because cancer cells typically have a lot of mutations, most of which are not favorable. And they also have many of them have high metabolic rates. And so when you put them in a fasting environment, healthy cells hold up a lot better than cancer cells. You want to keep in mind that there are many theories that people are constantly forming cancer cells, and that your body's constantly fighting these off. And as long as you're fighting them off faster than you're forming them, you stay healthy. But you start forming them faster than you can fight them off, and that's where things are able to set up housekeeping. And so one of the theories is that procedures like fasting that stimulate these processes may be helpful in preventing the formation, not just in treating it after it's occurred. Also, they found that beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the main ketone that's formed in human beings during fasting, actually provides protective effects on cells. It also affects mitochondrial function, and it results not only in better ATP production, but also enhances antiviral immunity. So it may be that we know that antibiotics are not effective at treating viral infections. Fasting does enhance some of the body's natural ability, and it may be why we see many people that come in with problems like herpes infections and others that do so much better after fasting. In lower eukaryote, simple organisms, fasting extends longevity, sometimes dramatically. For example, if you take these organisms and you put them in a normal environment, they live to a certain length of time. But if you put them in a fasting environment, sometimes their life expectancy goes up as much as 400%. Because these organisms have the ability to adapt to this environment. It's obviously an evolutionary process. In rodents, fasting protects, we know, against diabetes, cancer, heart disease, neurodegeneration. In humans, there's studies now looking at everything from high blood pressure and obesity to asthma and rheumatoid arthritis. Fasting delays the aging processes by protecting against the consequences of dietary excess. I'd like to share with you, I literally just got this data in a few weeks ago. We had a young girl who'd had a history with lymphoma. She'd been to her oncologist at Stanford. They worked her up. She followed up. The situation was progressing, as it's described here. She had large, palpable tumors. And finally, they got to the point where they suggested that she undergo chemotherapy and radiation, which is the traditional treatment for lymphoma. And she asked the doctors if diet was relevant, and they said no, diet wasn't really related to this particular condition. She asked about alternatives. They assured her there were no alternative treatments other than, chemotherapy and radiation. And she asked specifically about fasting. And the oncologist told her that that was criminal quackery. So because he was so encouraging, she decided to come to us and undergo a fast. And she did go through 21 days of water-only fasting, followed by 10 days of her feeding, at which time we promptly returned her to our oncologist at Stanford. And she said he did the double take, where he was looking at the chart, and he was examining her and looking at the chart, and he said, "What happened?" And she said, "I went to the criminal quacks, and I underwent 21 days of water-only fasting." At which point he said, "Well, I guess I'll have to have a talk with them." And so at this point, he told her that she's better. There's no sign of her lymphoma and to go away. We'll see next time if he'll give people the option. Another mechanism is enzyme induction. When you fast, you induce enzyme systems. The enzyme systems we're talking about here involve two different things. One, nutrient mobilization. Like when you have fat, how do you burn that? How does lipolysis work? Well, you have to use enzyme systems to mobilize those stores and put them into the body systems. And also, it turns out, detoxification involves enzyme systems. You have detoxifying enzyme pathways. Well, if you never induce your enzyme systems for mobilizing fat stores, let's say you never skip a meal, and you're always eating more, you don't catalyze those enzymatic pathways. And the same thing's true with detoxifying pathways. If you don't catalyze those pathways, you don't get maximum use out of them. Think about a trained athlete. Why does an athlete get better? What's part of the conditioning response is they're forcing mobilization of glycogen stores. They're inducing those pathways. That's part of what becoming a trained athlete is. What fasting does is essentially the same thing. It forces the induction of these nutrient-mobilizing and these detoxifying pathway systems. And it turns out those pathways that are catalyzed persist. So after fasting, you're more efficient at mobilizing nutrients, and you're more efficient at detoxifying. It doesn't just happen on the days that you're fasting. And it appears to be cumulative. So every time the animal or the human fasts, those pathways get more and more efficient. One that's receiving attention right now is BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is clearly enhanced during fasting. And this mediates fasting responses to not just appetite, but autonomic control of the nervous system, and it's thought to be involved with synaptic plasticity and neuronal resistance to injury. In other words, it's actually protecting the nervous system, which it makes a big deal in a number of conditions related to neural function. Insulin. You heard of insulin? Essentially a hormone that drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells. What would happen if your insulin wasn't working properly? What would happen to your blood sugar levels? They go up. What would we call that condition? Diabetes. Diabetes mellitus essentially is a condition where you have enough insulin. In fact, type 2 diabetics have more insulin, not less insulin, than a normal person. But the insulin's not working. There's resistance at the cell sites to insulin working. What causes insulin resistance? The diet that makes you fat. The diet that makes you fat is associated with creating insulin resistance. So it's not shocking to find out that when you go on a fast, that insulin resistance is improved. And in fact, about 80% of our type 2 diabetics are able to achieve normal blood sugars without the use of medication, through the use of fasting. So, fasting effects. We know that fasting decreases glucose and IGF-1, and it's similar to what exercise does. It reduces blood pressure and heart rate. It affects insulin, inflammation, as well as total microbial load. We're talking about gut microbial load. So we've got a reduction in those factors. We've got an increase in leptin, insulin sensitivity. We talked about cellular stress resistance, cellular stress adaptation, and autophagy. Do you know what autophagy is? It's where the body's immune system eats up stuff that shouldn't be there, like cancer cells. And fasting normalizes the microbiota balance in the gut, and it stimulates B-cell immunity. The bottom one, though, is probably most significant in that all of the major abnormalities that are associated with metabolic syndrome are positively affected by fasting. And so it's not surprising, like, who do we see the best results in? People that have conditions that are aggravated or caused by dietary excess tend to get tremendous benefit from fasting. Gut. Did you know that you have a tunnel that goes through your body? Like if you see somebody swallow something, you might think, well, now that's in their body, but it's not. It's going through their body. Okay? So, the tunnel starts up here at the mouth, and then down the esophagus into the stomach, and then it goes through the 3 parts of the small intestine, and then the 3 parts of the large intestine, until eventually what's left gets down here to the rectum, and then there's a hole down here at the end called the anus. So essentially you're shoving stuff in one hole and then eventually trying to push it out the other hole. But all the while, it's not in your body, it's merely going through your body. And this screen represents the mucosal membrane of your intestinal tract. And nothing gets into your body unless it's small enough to get through the tiny little holes of your screen that works very much like a screen does filtering out bugs. Like if you have a window open and you have a screen, the flies can't get in, can they? But what would happen if something damaged that screen so that the holes got bigger? Flies would get in. Same thing happens in the intestinal mucosa. If you have something damage your intestinal mucosa, you can get what's called gut leakage, where stuff leaks through that shouldn't be leaking through. Well, normally that's not a big problem at first because you have an immune system. And the phagocytes go in there and identify it and mark it and label it and eat things up, and your immune system kind of takes care of you. But in genetically vulnerable people, if this process goes on long enough, you can begin to develop very specific problems. For example, what people don't realize is in autoimmune diseases, what we call autoimmune diseases, it's actually your immune system that's creating the problem. For example, in arthritis, what causes the joint deformity? Your immune system attacking your cells. What about ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease? What's causing that inflammation? Your immune system. Vasculitis. Systemic lupus erythematosus. Even asthma and psoriasis and related conditions. A big part of that problem is your immune system attacking your cells. And it turns out that gut leakage may be a significant triggering mechanism in vulnerable people to this process. So you get an inflamed gut, proteins leak through, the immune system reacts, but for yet to be identified reasons, it gets confused and now begins to attack some of your own tissue. Depending which tissue your body attacks, depends on the name we give the condition. So what could cause inflammation in your gut? How about free radicals? Highly reactive molecules. If you wanted to get a bunch of free radicals so you could have a bunch of gut leakage, what would be the most effective behavior you could engage in? Right, smoking. Smoking is fabulously effective at generating free radicals. Witness, have you ever looked across the room and seen somebody and they have that premature, aged, puckered, wrinkled look, and you think, ooh, there must be a heavy smoker? How does that happen? Because the smoking is associated with free radicals, and that's what wrinkles are, is premature cross-linkaging of collagen tissues. So smoking, do you think it just causes smoker's face? No, of course it affects the whole body, including the animal lining of your blood vessels, which is why they try to say, well, how bad can smoking really be? 80% of smokers never get lung cancer. Yeah, because they die from heart disease before they live long enough to grow the tumors. I guess if you really wanted to be able to market a cigarette as cancer safe, you just have to make sure it kills everybody of heart disease early enough on. Fasting reverses the inflammation associated with gut leakage. You have an autonomic nervous system. It controls all the things you don't think about. For example, if you go out running, what would happen if your heart didn't speed up? You'd die. You wouldn't be able to get adequate oxygenation. You'd fall over and faint. It'd be a serious problem. Do you have to remember to tell your heart to beat faster? You think, okay, wake up, here we go. No, it does it automatically, doesn't it? And that automatic control of the heart and all the other things in your body that you don't have to think about are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It has two components, though, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And they work in concert with each other. They keep each other balanced. If either aspect of the autonomic nervous system becomes too facilitated, you get symptoms. And what's interesting is we've come up with hundreds of healing systems that effectively work to the degree that they impact the autonomic nervous system. Think about massage, chiropractic manipulation, osteopathic manipulation, biofeedback, meditation. What do you think all these things have in common? Is they have different levels of influence on the autonomic nervous system balance, and that's largely where their symptomatic relief comes from. Well, the most powerful effect on autonomic nervous system that I've ever come across is fasting. Fasting is like taking a computer that's corrupted, and you turn it off, and you reboot the hard drive, and you know how a lot of times stuff just kind of gets fixed? That's what fasting's like. It's like rebooting the hard drive in a computer. Psycho-spiritual impact. As I said, everywhere you look, people have been talking about fasting. Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus, and our patients all undergone fasting for long periods of time. I try to tell our patients that are doing long-term fasting, like 40 days, they're in good company. The immune system is actually enhanced during fasting. Some people intuitively think, well, if you aren't eating, that would probably make you vulnerable to infections and disease and other processes. It turns out to be just the opposite. Every objective measure of immune system function appears to be enhanced during the fasting process, which may be why a lot of things that just won't heal up feeding oftentimes do in fasting. They say fasting and adaptive cellular responses. It reduces oxidative damage, it reduces inflammation, optimizes energy metabolism, and enhances cellular protection. This was fun. We had a gentleman, he owns a laboratory that has the patent on a diagnostic test for human protozoa rheumatica. This is an organism, so they call it biofilm. It's associated with many conditions like lupus and some forms of cancer. And so this organism exists in people's blood, but there's no effective treatment for it because it's one of these that coats itself with a polysaccharide coating and therefore makes itself invulnerable to activation with antibiotics. So the frustrating thing is it doesn't do much good to have a patent on diagnosing something that there isn't a treatment for because nobody's ordering the test. So they wanted to figure out if there was a way to get this organism, this human protozoa rheumatica infection, to be responsive. Because they don't know, but they're thinking because it's high titers in people with these diseases, maybe somehow it's associated with the disease. If they can get rid of the organism, maybe they can get rid of the condition. And they put people on McDougall diets, and they noticed that the titers dropped, but they didn't completely go away. And the symptoms improved. So the patients with lupus that went on the McDougall plan diet had less symptoms, but they still had some titers. So they sent us, this was just recently, they sent us a subject with a very high titer, and they said, let's fast for a short fast, and then we'll try introducing different antibiotics and see if any of the antibiotics are effective at knocking out the organism. And we fasted for 12 days, retested, and what happened was it went from a very high titer to what? Nothing. So what did they say? They said, oh, darn, we fasted too long. We need to try to do it up here before it completely gets eliminated. Because if there's no organism left, there's nothing to treat. Finally, number 10, taste neuroadaptation. Have you ever gone from outside the bright light into a dark theater? You know how at first you can't see very good and you're trying to go down the aisle and you're stepping on people and and then finally the rods and cones in your eyes adapt and you can make use of the limited light and then you can see who you're sitting next to, right? Okay, that's an example of neuroadaptation. Well, the body does that in a lot of areas, not the least of which is taste. So if you're used to eating greasy, slimy, fatty, salty foods all the time, and you go to eat whole natural foods, it doesn't taste very good to you because your nervous cells aren't being banged like they're being used to. Well, in fasting, taste neuroadaptation is reset. And after fasting, good foods taste good. In fact, it's so powerful that a lot of times people will go and eat the heavily salted or heavily fat foods that they're used to like, and they realize it doesn't even appeal to them now because they've actually neuroadapted to a low-fat, low-salt diet. It reminds me, I told you when we had our union contract that we became a covered benefit. What I didn't tell you was the very first person that they sent to us was a guy, we just got this contract, and so they told this guy who had very high blood pressure, 240 over 140, they'd capped out his meds, and they said, you can't run the crane anymore because you'll kill people, and go to this place, they'll help you. So he comes up, but they don't tell him what the place is. He has no idea, who we are and what we do. And he shows up and he says, what am I doing here? And I said, oh, you're here to get well. And he says, I'm just fine. I said, you're not fine, you're sick. He says, I'm not sick. I said, you are sick, you got high blood pressure, diabetes, you're carrying a keg around, you're going to die. And he says, well, don't we all have to die? I said, well, yeah, but you're on $800 a month worth of medications you won't need once we get you healthy. And he says, what do I care? My union pays for my medications. And that's when I realized this wasn't my normal patient. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do with this guy? And I'm thinking about his medical history, and I thought, I said, well, if we get you off all those drugs for high blood pressure and diabetes, there's a pretty good chance we can do something about your little problem. He starts to sit up, and I'm thinking, uh-oh, because he's a big guy. He said, well, why the hell didn't you just say so? So we check him in, and now we're trying to feed him a little bit of food before we start fasting. Because this, when I look at his diet diary, that's what the guy ate. Not exactly that, because he would lift the bun up, take that piece of lettuce off, and get rid of it before he took his triple cheeseburger. So we're feeding him some vegetable material, some salads and stuff, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this guy has an esophageal tumor. Because he's like, clearly suffering. And I sit down next to him and I said, it looks like you're having a little trouble with the food. And he said, what food? He said, this is disgusting. He said, if I have to eat tasteless swill like this the rest of my life, I'd rather just die. He says, instead of fasting, why don't you just go out to my truck and get my 12 gauge and you can just shoot me in the head. So we check him in. 25 days later after fasting, and he's off his meds, he's done well, he's down eating the food. It's the same food. And he's eating the food. And I sit down next to him, I says, it looks like you're doing a little bit better with the food now. And he said, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. Took me 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food. He said, no, that stuff you tried to make me eat when I came in before was disgusting. He said, this stuff's not bad. How long would he have complied if we sent him home with a diet? Not even a meal. Couldn't have gotten him to eat one meal. Okay? Sometimes you use fasting because people are too sick to be able to do the diet and lifestyle changes long enough to get well. Sometimes you use fasting because, they have conditions that aren't responding in a reasonable time. Although I have to say, I understand Dr. McDougall says that we're the punishment. If you don't get well in 10 days, then he says, okay, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but off you go. They promised me last night I was going to get the slides on this. We just finished a 2.5-year study, what's called a fasting safety study, where we took 2,700 consecutive patients, the last 2,700 people that underwent fasting, and we looked at their risk factors, all-cause mortality, complications, etc., according to some standardized methodology. And the reason we did this is because you cannot get approval to do long-term studies in water-only fasting from human subject committees without a safety study, and there was never been a safety study done. And I'm happy to say we did just finish this data collection. The fancy slides and charts I was supposed to have didn't get here, but basically what it shows is there was no Category 5 or Category 4 events in any of the subjects undergoing water fasting. That's 2,700 patients, including a lot of really sick people that walk in. And of the 28 people that had what are called Category 3 events, most of these were people that had persistent high blood pressure that took a while to come down, so they showed up on the risk factors. Anytime blood pressure goes over 160, it shows up on our tracking thing. But those people also normalized as they came down. And so what we've done now, which is really exciting, through our nonprofit foundation, the TrueNorth Health Foundation, we've been able to produce a study that will be submitted to PLS Medicine this month. Once that's published, it'll open it up not just for us, but for Walter Longo and other people that are interested in pursuing fasting research on a long-term basis, because we've shown it can be done safely, it can be done effectively. And the future is very bright because fasting actually works at helping sick people get well. So it's kind of a new and novel intervention, although it is an ancient practice. We have 3 books. We have the Health Promoting Cookbook, which is our original cookbook, and the newer book, the Bravo Cookbook. These are vegan, SOS-free cookbooks, so they don't use any added sugar, oil, salt, gluten, or animal food. So they're rather unique in that regard, and they're very useful. And we also have our book, The Pleasure Trap, Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness. This is a disturbing book, and that's Dr. Lyle's fault. But it tells you not what you want to hear, but it does tell you what you need to know if you want to get healthy, and ultimately, I think you should all read it. If I have, I don't know if I'm out of time or not, but if I do have time, I'd like to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Alan. See, this is my friend, the Quack. Great job, Alan.
Thank you. It seems that the fasting would start an immediate loss of protein and therefore muscle mass, including heart muscle mass. Can you address that, please?
Yes, excellent question. Well, first of all, there is an immediate loss, about 75 grams the first day, but because of the biological adaptation to fasting, very, very rapidly, the body converts to this ketosis. By about 48, 72 hours, you're shifting predominantly into fat metabolism. In fact, we recently had a scientist at our facility with a calorimeter and actually has done that detailed analysis, and we'll be putting out an N of 1 paper to look at that. The literature is pretty clear. If any of you are interested, by the way, in getting questions that don't get answered today, or like, for example, if you want to, I can send you the paper, you can go to our website at healthpromoting.com. You can contact me either by email or through the website, and I'll be happy to send you some detailed papers on fasting review that have more information and show the breakdown, for example, this very issue that you'd want to know. But what I can tell you is that protein utilization in a resting state done properly is absolutely minimized. If you lost protein at the rate on day 1 and it didn't change, you wouldn't be able to fast but about a week. But because of this biological adaptation, there's only 1 in 10,000 people that really can't fast. Those are people that have MCAD, medium chain acetylcoenzyme A dehydrogenase deficiency. They're an enzymatic defect that prevents them from being able to convert fatty acids into fuel effectively. And so they wouldn't be able to fast. They would develop vomiting early on, and if you continued, that would be a bad outcome. So we don't fast those people. We test everybody to make sure that those kind of issues aren't present.
Thank you for your amazing presentation.
Thank you.
This really applies to my own personal story, and I'm curious about your the water dosing itself. I mean, do they drink casually just to eliminate the dry mouth, or how does the water dosing occur?
Okay, so we monitor their urines, and specifically their specific gravity. We have certain parameters that we want to maintain, because the water is the solute that the body's using for all of the material that's mobilized and eliminated. Virtually all of your toxins are always eliminated by your kidneys through the urine. I mean, the urine is basically the blood processed by the kidneys, and that's where almost all your metabolic and significant toxic products come out. It's not the stools, which are really all the stuff that never got absorbed through your intestinal mucosa. It's really the urine. So if you don't have water, you get hyperconcentration. It can be a problem. So we ask for at least 40 ounces a day, and we give people containers so they know what that means. And then we monitor the urine. If the urine gets too concentrated, we'll have them drink a little bit more. But we're always looking, just as a general baseline, of about 40 ounces of water as a minimum per day. And so, yeah, it is important. I just want to make this clear. When we're water fasting people, particularly, they're seen, the way it works is they come in, they have an exam with one of our medical doctors. They're seen twice a day by staff doctors. So we have morning and afternoon rounds. We have 2 educational programs a day that they go through. And we have 24-hour presence so that we're able to provide a level of supervision so that it is safe and effective. That's how we've gotten 2,700 people in a row to be able to do it. So the monitoring and the controlled environment, very important.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, do you recommend fasting for people who are following a healthy diet and who feel healthy? That was my first question. And my second question was, you mentioned that smokers' cravings go away after about 2 days. And I was wondering on other addictions like alcoholism, if there were similar effects.
Okay, so let me answer your second one first because I still remember that. My grandson calls me his AO. And I thought it was cute until I found out it stands for Ancient One. So as far as different addicts and different addictions show differently in fasting. Smokers usually, like I say, after a couple days, they're like amazed that they really don't have much in the way of cravings. Alcoholics, a lot of times, they go to sleep for a few days. So a lot of times they're inordinate amount of sleep, which is different than the nicotine. Different drugs have, different patterns that you see when people are fasting. But generally, fasting seems to be highly helpful, both in terms of speeding the process and also reducing the intensity of the process of withdrawal and addiction, not the least of which are people that are addicted to the dietary pleasure trap. Remember, people are fat and sick largely because they fool their brain's dopamine cascade by putting chemicals in their food called oil and sugar. Okay? And essentially, that's banging on the same cascade that you are when you're taking cocaine or other drugs. So maybe not quite as intense, although in the case of chocolate, who knows? But, from our viewpoint, pretty much everybody's an addict, whether they're addicted to nicotine or caffeine, or whether they're addicted to these chemicals added to their food like oil and sugar. And so people kind of go through these characteristic withdrawal effects in fasting. For example, if you can get people to eat healthily before they fast, they have a much easier time. Most of the patients that come from the McDougall program are what I call boring, because they've been eating this way, and so that the transition from the McDougall diet to fasting is relatively mild, and so you just don't get all the entertainment that we get from people that are coming off. Oh, let me tell you, it can be really fun. What was your first question?
If somebody is following like a McDougall-style diet and they also feel healthy, do you recommend fasting or a fast anyway at some point?
Well, I do, and I'll tell you why. Because fasting is kind of an interesting diagnostic tool. A lot of people that feel they're doing pretty well find out once they start fasting, maybe there's still some room for improvement. And remember, it's not just diet. It's also the air you breathe, the water you drink, the stress you live, your history, the medications you've had. There's a lot of things that accumulate in people. So even though now you may be keeping up, doesn't necessarily mean we wouldn't be able to make you miserable with a fast. And essentially, that's how we do it. How do I know somebody needs to fast? There's a couple simple indicators. Number one, they don't like the taste of good food. They're caught in the dietary pleasure trap. They don't want to eat good food. Doesn't taste good to them. Like my union guy. They need to fast. They fast until good foods taste good. People like good foods, but they're still having some problem. Maybe their blood pressure is still not where it should be. Their lipids aren't quite coming down. They're still having some joint problems. Even though they're doing their best with the diet and stuff, they need a little facilitating process. We'll use fasting for them. Okay? They have a problem that will not go away with dietary change alone. Okay? They've got a situation that needs that facilitation. Okay? So there's different classes of people. I think personally the people that get the most benefit from fasting are the healthiest people that are living healthily. And because of its effect both physically and also psychologically. There's a very empowering process that happens when people go for a period of time without eating and realizing they can do that. I mean, let me think. Most people, if they fly from New York to LA, they think that if they don't eat the peanuts, somewhere over Colorado, they're going to starve to death. A lot of people have problems with, their blood sugar drops. They feel cravings. They feel, this is all, as Dr. McDougall explains, a sign of food poisoning. And so what we do is we want to reboot and recalibrate that system so when they eat good, they feel good. I had a woman who came to me from England, very proper English lady. And her son was an internal medicine doc who made her come for her rheumatoid arthritis. And she came, and she was a little bit skeptical, but she did the program, and she did much better. And then she, when she left, she said, Dr. Goldhamer, I didn't mind the fasting, but I don't know about this diet nonsense. But I'll give it a shot. And at 6 months, I got a letter from her. She said, Dear Dr. Goldhamer, you were so right. When I eat crap, I feel crappy. If we can get people to the point where they feel good when they do the right thing, they're much more likely to continue to do the right thing. If you're having to have people go for weeks or months struggling with their symptoms, getting compliance is more difficult. The other thing is, once we have people in a captive environment, they say our sign should say the last resort. What I want to do is get one of those EPA signs that says, toxic waste dump. But the neighbors might complain.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Dr. Goldhamer. I'm one of those boring people that's followed the McDougall diet for a long time, and then several years ago I had a cancer diagnosis, so I found you and came to you, and I just wanted to say that thank you very much. But the fasting was much easier than actually eating every day and making choices, because I think my body was in a good place, but I saw a lot of people, as you described, that were sick and had issues, and it was very, very comfortable, and your staff was very nurturing. It was a very nurturing place. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mom. Actually, my mother just turned 88 years old, and she said she had 52 friends that she's had over her lifetime, and the last one just died. So all 52 friends are dead. And she said the worst part of it is, nobody left to say, I told you so, too.
I'm going to ask you for a generalization. You have somebody that's one of the boring people comes in, and they're eating right, they're on right weight, and in the course of a year, how often would you suggest they normally fast, and for what length of time?
Well, it really does depend on what their history is and what their presentation is. So, an ideally healthy person that has no medication use and no history, usually even a 5 to 7 day fast is enough to tell whether there's a problem. If they're still staying, like for example, my wife, Dr. Morano, eats beautifully, she exercises, does everything right. Every year fast, we just did a 5 day fast, very boring, no exciting stuff, that's it. If at day 5, though, you start getting some symptoms, then maybe we extend it until those symptoms clear. So, again, we use the fast diagnostically as well as therapeutically, but a 5 to 7 day fast is usually enough to tell kind of where we are with otherwise healthy people. So, the idea is to keep the fasting as short as possible, not as long as possible, but to do however much you need to get the job done. And I'll give you an example. There are some people, I had a woman at my facility, she was a dentist, and she had been outside, and those exterior temp holes fell over, hit her in the head. She got a dural tear. She had a headache. The headache didn't go away. She, for years, neurologist, heavy medications, very frustrated. After 16 years of constant daily headache, decided in desperation to come to the last resort, and she underwent fasting with us. We fasted her for 41 days. Now, she was only supposed to do a 40-day fast, but she said that she was a woman, and the men, Moses, David, Elijah, and Jesus, fasted for 40 days. She was a woman. She needed to go a little more. So she fasted 41 days. What was interesting, until day 26, she had constant daily headache, no change. On day 26, she woke up for 5 minutes in the morning of the 26th day. She said she had this weird sensation, no pain. It lasted about 5 minutes, and the pain came back.
Alan, we have lots of more questions. If you just take 2 more and give them good, you could talk for the whole day, I know. Okay. You're great. Let's just take a couple more questions. And by the way, you think Dr. Goldhamer is radical? You haven't seen me invite any bypass surgeons here to talk, have you?
She resolved her headache.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question's a little bit different, and I realize most of your presentation is about chronic diseases. My question has to do with, do you have any experience or any data or information about what happens in the acute care setting, like after major trauma, or for the period of time that after surgery, major surgeries, patients many times aren't eating for 4, 5, 6, 7 days?
Yeah, I don't have direct experience because that's not the patient population that we normally treat. We do a lot of post-surgical recovery, though, but it's not always with fasting. In our clinic, people go through fasting, but we also do a lot of healthy eating approaches as well. Not everybody's undergoing fasting, and most of the time, immediately after surgery wouldn't be the time that we would necessarily induce the vigors associated with the fasting process. So I really don't have much useful information for you there.
The reason I'm asking is because Dr. McDougall just sort of prompted me, but I am a surgeon, and I see this every day, and we have our patients going through this, not necessarily because of that we're intentionally doing this, but it's the healing phase, and so I just was curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
And there's a big push to feed patients early.
Yeah, I think that's probably a mistake, and probably would be an area that research would be really interesting to see just how much better a response we could use if we incorporate either fasting or modified fasting with patients. One thing I do know, if they'd stop feeding people all the stuff that caused them to have to go to surgery to begin with, they'd probably have a better outcome.
I think I have a simple question. What kind of water do you give these patients?
Patients that are water fasting are really sensitive. We use fractionally steam distilled water that we run a pre-filter and a post-filter. And during fasting itself, they're just so picky that you really have to have just pure water.
What is pure water?
It would be pre-filtered, fractionally steam distilled, post-filtered water. Just H2O.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that was, like I said, I could listen to him all the time, but all day long. But I have a chance to talk to you in a couple of minutes. So let's take about a 5-10 minute break, and then we'll get back together. Thank you, Alan.
fasting. In the past 30 years that I've been director at the TrueNorth Health Center, we have supervised this process of fasting and care with over 15,000 patients, and they've had a wide variety of problems. We have 48 people that make up the staff of TrueNorth Health, and they include doctors of medicine and osteopathy and chiropractic and naturopathy, as well as psychology. And we emphasize nutritional medicine, and we specialize in medically supervised water-only fasting. I'd like to start off here with a picture of a young girl. Her name is Kate. And she coincidentally happens to be my granddaughter. But Kate was one of 250 million babies born on this planet 5 years ago. But in what may be the most bizarre statistical anomaly of all time, my granddaughter Kate turned out to be the cutest one of all. What do you think the odds of that are? Now, my interest in nutritional medicine began when I was 9 years old, and I first met Dr. Doug Lyle. Back then, of course, he was just called Doug, because we were only in the 4th grade and he hadn't finished his doctorate yet. We actually met in a program for mentally gifted minors, where they took 30 students that had the highest test scores in the school district and put them all in the same classroom together. And it was quite obvious to me from the very start that Doug was much smarter and knew much more than the other children. And it didn't take long to realize that he knew much more and was much smarter than the teachers as well. But he had one very annoying habit. He always beat me in basketball, and it pissed me off. I practiced so that I could beat him, but it didn't work, because he also practiced. I read many books because I was looking for an edge. I read a book by this guy, Herbert Shelton, and what he said made sense to me, and so I adopted a vegan diet thinking that would give me the leverage I needed. But it failed. He also adopted a vegan diet and made my career decision that I had decided to become a chiropractor. I thought my Uncle Gene was going to have a stroke and die. The veins in his neck stuck out so far, and he's screaming, "Chiropractor! Chiropractor! No one in this family is allowed to go to a chiropractor, let alone be a chiropractor." He said, "Better you should be a communist spy." After he left, my father, who was a very serious man, he took me aside. He said, "Son, your Uncle Gene is a very prominent medical doctor, and he does not approve of your idea of becoming a chiropractor." He says, "In my opinion, anything that makes Uncle Gene that angry, that mad, well, it can't be bad." He said, "So I say good luck to you, son." I went to chiropractic college in Oregon, and the most important thing I got from college was my wife. I met my wife, Dr. Jennifer Morano, and she's continued to renew my marriage contract every year. And this July will be our 30th anniversary, and this year I'm going to ask for a 2-year extension. I think after 30 years, I deserve it. After chiropractic college, I enrolled in the Pacific College of Osteopathic Medicine in Sydney, Australia, and I completed an internship with Dr. Alec Burton, who operates the Arcadia Health Center that specializes in medically supervised water-only fasting. I was able to receive extensive training and experience involved in fasting supervision, and I helped care for hundreds of patients that were undergoing fasting. And I saw something really unique when I was in Australia, and that was I saw patients actually getting well. Under traditional medical care, patients with high blood pressure, with diabetes, with autoimmune diseases, do not get well. They are told to take the drugs for the rest of their lives. So how does your doctor know that you need to take drugs for the rest of your life? Because they're guaranteeing you that if you do what you're told and you take your drugs, you'll never get well. You'll be sick the rest of your life. Soon after we began treating patients with diet and fasting, a book came out. And it used the scientific literature to support the diet that we'd been advocating. And it was called, and to this day, 47 years later, he continues to kick my butt. Most recently, after weeks of practice, I challenged him to a free throw shooting contest. And I hit 48 out of 50 free throws, and I thought, that ought to do it. Dr. Lyle made 19, missed one, and then he hit 80 in a row. That's right, 99 out of 100. Of course, rather than congratulate him, I pointed out that, sure, Doug, you hit 99 out of 100, but you missed one. That's called choking. As a teenager, I met a guy named Gerald Benish, who was a chiropractor. And he told me that he had the best job in the whole world. He said his patients actually did all the work, their bodies did all the healing, and all he had to do was take credit for the good results. And I decided right then and there, that was the job for me. When I turned 16 years old, my mother had prepared a special family dinner to celebrate my birthday. And because she was concerned about my vegan diet, she invited my Uncle Gene to join us, hoping he would talk some sense into me. My Uncle Gene was a medical doctor. He trained residents at the local VA, and he knew absolutely everything about absolutely anything. He reassured my mother that children go through diet fads, and that so long as I ate plenty of chicken and gefilte fish, I'd survive. I explained to my Uncle Gene that it's called being a vegan and involves avoiding animal foods of any kind. He said it's called being a Meshuggah and I should stop the nonsense immediately. You know, as it was my 16th birthday, I knew that my father would have to have that embarrassing talk with me that all fathers have to have with their teenage sons, where they discuss, well, you know, what you're going to do for a living. Now, I came from a very liberal family. They believed that you could go to school anywhere, that you could study anything, so long as you ended up with a degree in law or medicine. So to save my father the trouble of having the talk, I decided to announce to the family that I had
And you know that my job is as a medical doctor, and what I do and what I've done for the last, a long time, maybe 38 years, trying to convince people that they ought to stop food poisoning, eat well, not take medications. And for maybe 26 of those years, I've had live-in programs, currently at the Flamingo Resort in Santa Rosa, California. So what I do is I take and I lock people up and I make them eat good food. Food costs money. Some people don't listen to what I have to say. Some don't do as well as I would like. So what I do then, I'm going to tell you my secret. What I do then, after they fail the McDougall program, is I send them down the street 4 city blocks to a place called TrueNorth, where the food expenses are quite a bit less than ours, because at TrueNorth, you get water. TrueNorth is a very world famous fasting center where they take care of people from all over the world. Yeah, they do, I'm exaggerating a little bit, they do feed them food, but also part of the program is a water fasting. So when I tell people who I either can't help get better, I say there's one more choice. Or, believe it or not, there's some people who won't listen to me. And I say, you think what I recommend is tough? Go 4 blocks down and see TrueNorth. And I seriously mean it. I send people on occasion 4 city blocks down the street to a phenomenal place called TrueNorth, where they get physician care. They do get food similar to ours, but one of the primary tools is a treatment that's been used. Well, I'll let our speaker tell you how long it's been used, what the history is, what it's all about, but this is another approach. You think everything's failed? You think there's nothing else to do? Well, let's have Dr. Alan Goldhamer tell us what else we can do. Welcome, Alan. And by the way, he's been my friend for over 30 years, and I do mean my friend. Thank you, Alan.
This morning, my goal is to share with you the experiences that I've had using a very ancient practice, the McDougall plan. It was written by Dr. John McDougall, and it was the start of a change in the way people thought about diet. I'm not sure exactly whatever became of Dr. McDougall. I imagine he must be getting pretty old by now. The McDougall plan inspired us to try to scientifically support the work that we were doing with fasting. And we began to systematically collect data on the results we were achieving, and specifically with high blood pressure. Later, with the help of one of my patients, Dr. T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, we were able to publish a couple papers in the scientific literature. Now, all the while we were conducting this research, my Uncle Gene refused to even look at our results. He said that in 50 years he'd been in practice, no one ever got well with high blood pressure, that we probably didn't know how to take blood pressures if we thought people were actually getting well. He said that if our results ever appeared in a peer-reviewed index journal, then he would look at them. A few weeks before our paper was released, my Uncle Gene died of a massive cardiac arrest. My mother insists that my Uncle Gene died just so he wouldn't have to admit he was wrong. I think he may have died from eating too many blintzes, kugel, kreplach, and knishes, but maybe we'll never know. So we picked high blood pressure to look at for a number of reasons. Number one, it was a major contributing cause of death and disability. Number two, it was pretty easy to monitor. And it was something that we saw consistent results on. If you look at this table here, you notice the only thing that really exceeds high blood pressure as a contributing cause of death and disability is really smoking. And actually, high blood pressure is catching up because, to a large extent, the smokers are dying. As far as blood pressure, the top number of blood pressure, when you measure blood pressure measured, there's two numbers. There's the top number, the bottom number. The top number, or systolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of the blood in the vessels when the heart contracts. And the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of the blood in the vessels when the heart's in its relaxation mode. And it turns out each of these numbers is a sensitive indicator of all-cause mortality. That is, whether you're going to die prematurely or not. Interesting facts. As I mentioned, high blood pressure, one of the leading contributing causes of death and disability. We're talking about 287,000 people dying from congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure is when your heart muscle itself loses integrity.